Welcome to Tales of the Bard. Step into a world where stories come alive and imagination knows no bounds. Join me as I weave enchanting tales reminiscent of the bards of old, sharing legends, myths, and original stories that will transport you to distant lands and forgotten times. Jonty returned the next night, his lute in hand, and the familiar warmth of the tavern greeting him like an old friend. The tavern was packed once again, the patrons eager for another tale, still riding high from the dramatic defeat of the trolls the night before. The fire crackled, the barmaid served drinks with quick efficiency, and the tavern keeper flashed Jonty a wide smile as he made his way toward the hearth. But tonight, the air buzzed with a particular question, murmured between the patrons. How did the fire drakes first ally with Ronan? Jonty, always keen to follow the interest of his audience, settled down with his lute and strummed a slow, haunting melody. The tavern grew quiet, the anticipation thick in the air. The first alliance of fire and earth. The story of the fire drakes' alliance with the Druids is one that stretches back through the ages. Long before Ronan's time, Jonty began, his voice low and filled with the weight of ancient history. Long before the kingdoms of men, before the paladins of the sacred flame, and even before the rise of the elves as the masters of the seas, the world was raw, untamed, and filled with wild, elemental forces. The bard's fingers danced across the lute strings, the notes reflecting the untamed nature of the world he described. In that time, the fire drakes were beings of pure flame and fury, dwelling deep within the heart of the mountains, where magma flowed like rivers and the very air burned with heat. These drakes were not the cunning creatures we know today, but primal forces of destruction, their breath capable of turning forests to ash and their wings stirring the winds into infernos. Jonty's voice grew quieter, more mystical. But the world was not theirs alone. In those ancient times, the Druids were born of the earth, the keepers of balance. The first Druids did not merely tend to the trees and animals as Ronan does today. They were warriors, tasked with keeping the forces of nature from tearing the world apart. And so it was inevitable that the Druids and the fire drakes would clash. The Great Conflict. The music shifted, growing more intense like the crackling of flames. In the early days, the fire drakes and the Druids were bitter enemies. The drakes, driven by their nature, would often emerge from their fiery homes to scorch the lands, burning everything in their path. The Druids, protectors of the natural world, sought to stop them, using the power of the trees, the rivers, and the mountains to push back the infernos. Jonty paused, his fingers hovering over the strings. The battles between the drakes and the Druids were fierce, clashes of fire against earth, flame against stone. The drakes, for all their power, could not be tamed, and the Druids, despite their magic, struggled to contain the wild fury of the drake's fire. But, Jonty added with a knowing smile, the world, as wild as it was, also has a way of bringing even the fiercest enemies together. The turning point, a great cataclysm. Jonty's music softened, taking on a somber tone. The turning point in their conflict came not from battle, but from a great cataclysm. Deep within the mountains where the fire drakes made their home, the earth began to quake. The ground split open, and the volcanoes that housed the drakes began to erupt with uncontrollable fury. It was a disaster unlike any the world had seen. Magma spewed into the sky, and the heat was so intense it threatened to consume everything, even the drakes themselves. The patrons listened in rapt silence as Jonty continued. The drakes, despite their fiery nature, were in danger of being overwhelmed by the very forces they had once controlled. The eruption grew so fierce that it threatened to destroy not only the mountains but the forests, rivers, and all the lands that surrounded them. The bard's voice grew softer, more deliberate. And so, in their desperation, the Druids were faced with a choice. They could allow the fire to burn everything, or they could save the drakes, their old enemies, and in doing so, save the world. A pact forged in fire. The music shifted again, the notes lighter now, filled with the promise of something new. The Druids, wise in their ways, knew that the forces of nature had to remain in balance. They could not allow fire to consume the world, but neither could they snuff it out entirely. So the eldest of the Druids, a powerful mage known only as Erdan the Rootbinder, ventured into the heart of the flames where the fire drakes roared in agony. Jonty smiled, his fingers picking up a steady rhythmic melody. Erdan reached out to the drakes, not with magic meant to contain them, but with magic meant to connect. He called upon the Blue Tree Network, tapping into the ancient power of the earth, and in doing so, he spoke to the drakes not as enemies, but as equals, creatures of the world bound by the same fate. "Let us make a pact," Erdan said, his voice echoing through the flames. "You are creatures of fire, and we are of the earth. Alone we destroy. Together we can build something far greater. Your fire gives life, and our earth gives it form. Let us work as one to bring balance to the world." The bard's music grew softer, more intimate. The drakes, though primal and fierce, sensed the truth in Erdan's words. They were creatures of fire, yes, but even fire needed to be tempered. And so the drakes, led by their largest and oldest, a great drake known as Scalder the Eternal Flame, bowed their heads and agreed to the pact. The alliance sealed. Jonty's voice swelled with pride as he described the forming of the alliance. With the pact sealed, the Druids and the fire drakes worked together to stabilize the volcanoes. Erdan and the Druids used their magic to channel the power of the blue trees, guiding the molten rivers of magma back into the earth, while the drakes flew above, their wings calming the fiery winds and their breath quelling the flames. The bard's fingers moved faster, the music growing in intensity as the scene unfolded. For the first time, the Druids and the drakes worked side by side, their powers intertwined in perfect harmony. And when the final eruption subsided and the earth cooled beneath their feet, both sides knew they had created something stronger than either could have achieved alone. Jonty smiled, his voice growing soft once more. From that day forward, the fire drakes became allies of the Druids. They swore an eternal bond, vowing to come to the aid of the Druids whenever they called upon the Blue Tree Network. In return, the Druids promised to keep the balance of the world in check, ensuring that fire, earth, water, and air would always remain in harmony. The legacy of the fire drakes. The bard's music slowed, his voice filled with wonder as he brought the story to its conclusion. And so, for generations, the drakes remained in their volcanic homes, answering the call of the Druids only in times of great need. Their fiery breath became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the most destructive forces of nature could be harnessed for good. Jonty's fingers plucked one last soft note, leaving the tavern in thoughtful silence. That is how Ronan, through the ancient pact forged by his ancestors, was able to call upon the fire drakes. The alliance, though old, remained as strong as ever, bound by the power of the Blue Tree Network and the drakes' loyalty to the Druids. The patrons, enchanted by the tale, nodded and murmured to one another. Jonty smiled, knowing that he had once again woven a story that left them with a deeper understanding of the world of Ronan and Lira. The fire drakes, once enemies of the Druids, were now their fiercest allies, creatures of flame and fury, but tempered by the wisdom of the earth. With a final bow, Jonty stood, his lute hanging at his side. "I shall return tomorrow night, my friends, with more tales of fire and earth, of battles yet to come, and the magic that binds it all together." And with that, the bard disappeared into the night once more, leaving the tavern buzzing with excitement for the next part of the tale. The tavern was filled with the quiet hum of conversation as the patrons settled back into their seats, eager for Jonty's return. After the gripping tale of the fire drakes and their alliance with the Druids, many had wondered what could come next. Tonight, however, a new question was on everyone's lips. How will the fire drakes be rewarded for their aid? Jonty, stepping into the warm glow of the fire once more, was quick to notice the curiosity in the air. He strummed his lute softly, letting the gentle notes build anticipation. After settling into his usual spot by the hearth, he gave the room a knowing smile. "The fire drakes may be creatures of power and flame," Jonty began, "but even the mightiest among them has desires, longings tied to the ancient forces they embody. Their reward would not be gold or jewels, for such things mean little to creatures born of the earth's molten heart. No, their reward would be far greater, something tied to the very essence of what they are." The bard's fingers played a deeper, more primal tune, filled with the weight of ancient magic. The tavern quieted as Jonty began his tale, the eternal gift of flame. When the fire drakes descended from the skies to aid Ronan and Lira in their battle against the Mountain trolls, they did so not for riches or titles, but for honor. Their ancient pact with the Druids was one forged in balance, in the knowledge that all forces in the world, fire, earth, air, and water, must remain in harmony. And so, when the trolls lay smoldering in the ashes and the battle was won, Ronan knew that their loyalty and sacrifice deserved more than simple thanks. The bard's voice softened, as though sharing a sacred secret. Ronan, ever wise in the ways of the wilds, knew that fire itself is a living force. The fire drakes, though powerful, had a deep yearning to grow, to have their flames burn brighter, hotter, and last for all time. And so, Ronan turned to the Blue Tree Network, the ancient magic of the Druids, to grant them something they had long desired. A gift from the earth itself. Jonty's fingers danced across the strings, conjuring the image of the vast, sprawling forests and the deep roots that stretched beneath them. Ronan knelt before the oldest of the blue trees, its trunk glowing faintly with the power of the earth. Through the roots of the tree he sent out a call, not for creatures of the wild, but for the spirit of the earth itself. He sought to offer the drakes something no other could give, eternal flame, a fire that would never dim, never be extinguished, as long as the balance of the world remained intact. The bard's voice grew softer, filled with reverence. From the heart of the earth, deep within the magma flows and the molten core of the world, the essence of fire answered. It was a force older than the drakes themselves, the very fire from which their kind had been born. Ronan, through his connection to the Blue Tree Network, spoke with this ancient fire, offering it to the drakes as a reward for their loyalty. The ceremony of flame. The patrons listened in rapt silence as Jonty described the next scene. Ronan called the fire drakes to the sacred grove where the blue tree stood tall and strong. The drakes, led by their largest and oldest, Scalder the eternal flame, landed in the clearing, their eyes glowing with curiosity. They had felt the pull of the earth, the ancient magic stirring beneath their feet, and they knew something great was about to happen. The bard's fingers plucked a slow, ceremonial rhythm. Ronan raised his staff high, and from the earth, a flame unlike any other erupted. A flame so pure, so powerful that even the fire drakes felt its heat. This was the Heartfire, the flame from which all fire in the world was born. It was the source of the drakes' power, the fire that had given them life at the dawn of time. The patrons gasped softly as Jonty described the scene. Ronan, his voice filled with the power of the wilds, spoke to the drakes. "This is the Heartfire," he said, his voice echoing in the clearing. "It is the flame from which all fire flows, and as a reward for your loyalty, for your honor in battle, I offer you a bond with the Heartfire itself. Your flames will burn brighter, stronger, and longer than any before. You will be immortal in your flame as long as the balance of the world is maintained." The fire drake's immortality. Jonty's music grew more intense, filled with the primal energy of fire. The fire drakes, their eyes wide with awe, approached the Heartfire, feeling its heat wash over them. Scalder, the eldest of the drakes, stepped forward first. His scales glowed with a molten light as he bent his head toward the flame. And as the Heartfire touched him, his entire body blazed with power. His wings flared out, their edges glowing like the sun, and his roar shook the very mountains. The bard smiled, his voice filled with wonder. One by one, the drakes approached the Heartfire, their flames merging with it, their bodies infused with its eternal power. And from that moment on, the fire drakes were no longer just creatures of fire. They became guardians of flame, their power tied to the very core of the earth. Their flames would never extinguish, their breath never weaken. They became immortal in their element, as long as the balance of the world was maintained. A sacred bond. Jonty's fingers slowed, the tension easing as he described the lasting effects of the ceremony. The bond between the fire drakes and the druids became stronger than ever. The drakes, now empowered by the Heartfire, swore an even deeper loyalty to the druids and the Blue Tree Network. They became protectors of the wilds, knowing that as long as the balance of the world was kept, their flames would burn for eternity. The bard's voice softened. But the Heartfire is not just a gift, it is a responsibility. The fire drakes know that if the balance of the world is ever disturbed, if the forces of darkness grow too strong, their flames could flicker and die, and so they watch over the wilds, ever vigilant, ready to answer the call of the druids whenever they are needed. A new era of power. Jonty's final notes were filled with triumph, a promise of the power and responsibility that now rested on the shoulders of the drakes. And so the fire drakes, now immortal in their flame, continue to soar through the skies, their wings trailing fire and their hearts blazing with the power of the Heartfire. They are no longer just creatures of destruction. They are guardians of balance, tied forever to the fate of the world. The bard smiled as he looked around the room, his voice soft but filled with pride. This, my friends, is how the fire drakes were rewarded, not with gold or riches, but with the eternal flame of the Heartfire, a power greater than any wealth. And as long as they remain true to the Druids and the balance of the world, their flames will never die. The tavern was quiet for a moment, the weight of the story settling over the patrons. Then slowly the room erupted into applause, mugs raised in appreciation for the tale. Jonty, his lute still in hand, gave a small bow, knowing that the story of the fire drakes had left its mark on their hearts. As the patrons clapped and cheered, Jonty smiled. And so, the tale of Ronan and Lira and their fiery allies continues, but that is a story for another night. With a final strum of his lute, Jonty rose and disappeared into the night, leaving the tavern buzzing with excitement for what the next chapter would bring. The tavern was alive with the soft clink of mugs and murmured conversations as Jonty returned to his usual spot near the hearth. This night, however, felt different. The air was still charged with the excitement of battles and fiery drakes, but the patrons seemed eager for a different kind of tale, one of peace, respite, and a well-deserved moment of rest. Jonty smiled, sensing their desire for a softer note in the epic tale. With a strum of his lute, he began weaving a gentler melody, one that promised tranquility and reflection. A moment of respite. After the fierce battle with the mountain trolls and the orcs, after the roar of flames and the crack of stone underfoot, Ronan and Lira found themselves weary but victorious. Jonty began, his voice calm, like a soothing breeze after a storm. The fire drakes had departed, their wings leaving trails of smoke in the sky as they returned to their fiery dens. Skryla, their faithful ally, led them away from the battlefield, her silken webs whispering softly in the wind as she guided them back through the winding paths of the northern mountains. The bard's fingers moved gently over the strings, the music evoking the soft rustle of leaves and the distant sound of a flowing stream. Though the air was cold and the mountains were harsh, Ronan and Lira could feel the weight of their journey finally lifting. They had earned a moment of peace, a rare break in their long quest. And as they walked beside Skryla, her many legs moving with surprising grace, they couldn't help but ask the question that had been lingering in their minds. Jonty smiled, his voice filled with warmth. Ronan turned to the great spider, his eyes showing the fatigue of the day's battles. Skryla, he asked, do you know of any hot springs nearby? We could use a place to rest, and perhaps a bath. The bard's music lightened, a note of amusement threading through the melody. Skryla, ever the clever one, gave a small, knowing smile, a gesture that looked almost comical on her many-eyed face. There is a place, she said, her voice echoing in Ronan's mind through Wildspeak. A place hidden deep within the mountains, where the earth's warmth rises to the surface, and the waters are as soothing as the finest balm. The hidden spring. Jonty's fingers danced across the strings as he described the journey. Skryla led them deeper into the mountains, through a series of narrow, twisting paths known only to her. The air grew warmer as they descended, the chill of the mountain winds giving way to the earth's natural heat. The sound of bubbling water began to fill the air, growing louder with each step. The bard's voice softened, filled with the promise of tranquility. And then, as they rounded a final bend, the path opened up into a small, hidden grotto. There, in the heart of the mountains, lay a hot spring, its waters steaming in the cool air, surrounded by moss-covered stones and soft greenery. The warmth of the spring beckoned them, its surface rippling gently as if welcoming them to rest. Jonty's smile grew wider, his music soft and comforting. Ronan and Lira exchanged a glance, both of them feeling the weight of their exhaustion more keenly than ever. They had fought hard, endured much, and now they stood before a place of peace, a place untouched by the battles raging in the world beyond. A silken seal of peace. The bard's fingers strummed a slower, more intimate tune. As they prepared to enter the spring, Skryla remained at the edge of the grotto, her many eyes watching them with a kind of motherly care. "I will ensure your peace is not disturbed," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. With a flick of her long, delicate legs, she spun a web of silken threads, covering the entrance to the grotto with a magical barrier, as light as a breeze yet strong enough to keep any unwanted visitors at bay. Jonty's music shifted slightly, reflecting the warmth and safety of the moment. The silk shimmered in the low light, glowing faintly with the magic imbued in it. Ronan and Lira knew that as long as Skryla's web remained, no harm would come to them. It was as if the grotto itself had been sealed off from the world, a sanctuary created just for them. The bard's voice was soft, almost a whisper now. With the entrance sealed and the world locked away, Ronan and Lira finally let themselves relax. They shed the weight of their armor and weapons, the tension slipping from their bodies as they lowered themselves into the hot, soothing waters. A moment of connection. Jonty's fingers lingered on a gentle flowing melody, the music reflecting the calm of the moment. The water enveloped them like a warm embrace, the aches of battle slowly dissolving in the heat. Ronan leaned back against the smooth stone, his eyes half closed as he let the water work its magic. Lira, her red hair shimmering in the steam, floated beside him, her hand resting on the amulet of Carulius around her neck. The bard smiled, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. For the first time in what felt like ages, they were able to simply be, no trolls, no orcs, no drakes or battles, just the quiet hum of the hot spring and the soft rustle of the silken web overhead. Ronan glanced over at Lira, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'd almost forgotten what peace felt like," he murmured. Jonty's music took on a lighter, more playful note. Lira chuckled softly, the sound of her laughter mingling with the bubbling of the spring. "Well, we should enjoy it while it lasts," she replied, leaning her head back against the stone. "Knowing us, it won't last long." Skryla's watchful eye. The bard's music deepened slightly, a note of protectiveness woven into the melody. As Ronan and Lira soaked in the warmth of the spring, Skryla remained at the entrance, her many eyes scanning the surrounding area. Though she had sealed the grotto with her webs, her senses were keen, and she remained ever vigilant. The battle may have been over, but Skryla knew that danger could return at any moment. Jonty's voice grew thoughtful. But in that moment there was no threat, no sound of approaching enemies, no tremors in the earth. The world beyond the grotto was still, and Skryla allowed herself to relax just for a moment. She had fought beside Ronan and Lira, spun her webs to protect them, and now she stood guard over their peace, ensuring that they would have this moment to rest and recover. A rare peace. Johnny's fingers played the final, delicate notes of the melody, his voice filled with a sense of closure. For Ronan and Lira, that night in the hot spring was a rare gift, a chance to forget, even if just for a little while, the weight of the world they carried. The warmth of the water, the gentle protection of Skryla's webs, and the quiet of the mountains gave them the peace they so desperately needed. The bard let his last note ring out, leaving the tavern in a quiet, reflective silence. And though they knew the journey ahead would be filled with more danger, more battles, and more challenges, they also knew that moments like this, moments of peace and connection, were what made the fight worth it. Jonty leaned back, the lute resting gently in his lap as the patrons took in the quiet beauty of the tale. The tavern was still for a moment, the fire casting soft shadows on the walls, and then, slowly, the room erupted into gentle applause. The bard smiled, knowing that he had given them a glimpse of something softer, something more personal. As the applause died down, Jonty stood, giving a small bow. "I will return with more tales soon, my friends, but for now, let us all enjoy a moment of peace, just as Ronan and Lira did." With a final nod, Jonty made his way toward the door, leaving the patrons with a feeling of calm and warmth, knowing that the adventure would continue soon enough. The tavern fell into a hush as Jonty, sensing that the audience was ready for a new twist in the tale, strummed a softer, more mysterious chord on his lute. His eyes glinted with anticipation as he leaned forward, his voice lowering to draw the patrons in closer. The healing waters. As Ronan and Lira soaked in the soothing warmth of the hidden hot spring, the tension of the battle seemed to melt away, their minds and bodies finally able to relax after the turmoil of their journey. But what neither of them realized, at least not at first, was that there was something more to these waters, something far more powerful than mere heat and steam. Jonty's fingers plucked a slower, more hypnotic rhythm, mirroring the subtle shift that was about to unfold in the story. Ronan had been resting his arm on the smooth rocks at the edge of the spring, his mind wandering as he looked up at the stars beginning to twinkle through the mist. It was only when he shifted slightly, reaching up to stretch, that he noticed it. The bard's voice grew quiet, filled with wonder. His arm, covered in scratches from the battle with the trolls and orcs, was healing. The cuts were sealing themselves, the skin knitting back together right before his eyes. Ronan blinked in disbelief, staring down at his arm as the final trace of injury disappeared into smooth, unblemished skin. Astonishment in the waters. The patrons in the tavern exchanged glances, leaning in even closer as Jonty's music became more insistent. Ronan, still in shock, turned to look at Lira, who was resting with her eyes closed, her head tilted back in peaceful relaxation. "Lira," he called softly, his voice trembling with amazement. Jonty paused, his fingers hovering over the strings as if suspended in the same disbelief that Ronan felt. Lira opened her eyes slowly, blinking in confusion at the tone in Ronan's voice. But before she could speak, Ronan pointed to her arm. The small scar she had carried since childhood, a mark that had always been there, had vanished. Her skin was flawless, untouched by the battles she had fought. The bard smiled as the tavern collectively gasped. Lira sat up quickly, her eyes wide as she looked down at her own arms, then back at Ronan. "What? How?" she whispered, her voice filled with astonishment. Jonty's music swelled, the tempo rising as the patrons in the tavern became more engrossed in the unfolding mystery. Ronan and Lira stared at each other, both of them feeling the same sense of wonder. The hot spring, it seemed, was no ordinary place. The water, warm and inviting, had done more than just ease their tired muscles. It had healed them. "Feel free to ask if you need any further adjustments or additional assistance,"